I have made my decision. 4 words. That was all Oliver Kingsley gave her after 8 years of marriage. Caroline Wentworth had saved his estate from ruin, managed his accounts, protected his name, and he was leaving her for a woman he had known 3 months. 3 months against 8 years. She did not beg. She did not weep. She set down their wedding portrait and spoke the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. If you have ever loved someone who refused to see you, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight? The fire had burned low in the great hall of Kingsley Estate by the time Caroline Wentworth understood that her marriage was over. Not from a letter. Not from a rumor carried on the lips of a housemaid. She understood it the way a woman understands most terrible things in her bones before the words arrived. She had been holding their wedding portrait when Oliver walked in. 8 years. 8 years pressed into a single frame of painted canvas. Oliver younger, his jaw set with the particular pride of a man who believed the world owed him something, and Caroline beside him, her eyes steady, her hands folded, already wearing the expression of a woman who had learned to wait. She had been 20 years old when she married him. She was 28 now. Oliver set his traveling bag near the door. He did not look at her directly. He stood beside the fireplace with the posture of a man who had rehearsed something and was determined to deliver it regardless of consequence. Caroline watched him. She already knew. Oliver. His jaw tightened. Caroline. A pause. I have made my decision. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Flat. Final. The kind of words a man uses when he has already moved past the conversation in his mind and is simply waiting for the other person to catch up. Your decision. She kept her voice even. About what exactly? He turned toward the window rather than toward her. I am leaving for London in the morning. Caroline set the portrait down on the side table. Carefully. The way you set down something precious when you suspect you may not pick it up again. And who is in London, Oliver? He did not answer immediately. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the east wing of the house, a door closed, one of the servants retiring for the evening, knowing nothing of what was happening in this room. Her name is Miss Hartwell. He said it to the window. She is. I have come to care for her deeply. How long? Caroline. How long have you cared for her deeply? A silence stretched between them. Not the comfortable silence of a couple who had lived beside each other long enough to share wordless rooms. This was the silence of a confession being weighed. 3 months. 3 months. Caroline stood very still. She had spent the better part of a decade repairing the damage Oliver's father had done to the Kingsley estate. Before she arrived as a young bride, the accounts had been a disaster. Debt stacked upon debt. Merchant agreements. Defaulted tenant contracts, written so carelessly that half the farmland was essentially being given away. She had seen it all within her first season of marriage and said nothing to Oliver because he was proud and she was young, and she did not yet understand that silence in a marriage is never neutral. She learned eventually. She always learned. She had taught herself to read land surveys. She had sat across from hard-faced solicitors twice her age and negotiated terms that Oliver never knew were being negotiated. She had ridden out in November rain to speak with tenant farmers who were ready to leave, and she had listened to their grievances, actually listened, not the way Oliver listened, which was to nod while already composing his response. And she had found solutions, practical ones, and the farmers had stayed. The estate had survived because of her, and Oliver had known none of it. He thought it survived because he was Oliver Kingsley, heir to Kingsley Manor, a man of natural standing and reasonable intelligence. He thought survival was simply what happened to people like him. 3 months. She is young, Caroline asked. Oliver shifted his weight. She is 23. And she admires you very much, I imagine. He turned from the window then. Something in his expression, not quite guilt, not quite defensiveness, something caught between the two. She understands me, Caroline. Does she? She listens. She makes me feel as though I am worthy of admiration. The word landed harder than she intended, or perhaps exactly as hard as she intended. Even Caroline could not have said with certainty. Oliver's expression darkened. You have never understood what I needed. Caroline looked at the man she had loved for 8 years, genuinely had loved with the particular stubbornness of a woman who believes that patience is a form of devotion, and felt something shift inside her. Not break. She had expected breaking. She had braced herself for it in the weeks since she had first begun to suspect lying awake beside him in the dark, and listening to him breathe, and wondering if this was already over. But it was not breaking she felt. It was something closer to clarity. You needed your estate saved, she said. I saved it. You needed your father's debts settled before they became public scandal. I settled them. You needed someone to manage the tenant accounts when Holloway left without notice. I managed them. I needed a wife. His voice rose. Not an estate manager, not an accountant, a wife. I was your wife, Oliver. I was also everything else because there was no one else to be it. He crossed his arms. That gesture, she knew it well. It meant he had stopped listening and was simply waiting for his turn to speak again. Miss Hartwell does not concern herself with accounts and tenants and— No, Caroline agreed. She concerns herself with making you feel admired, for now. You don't know her. I know what she knows. She knows you for 3 months of best behavior. She knows the Oliver Kingsley who can afford to be charming because someone else is managing his difficulties. She paused. I wonder what she will think of you when she learns what I know. Oliver's jaw set. I did not come here to argue. Then why did you come here? A long silence. To tell you, he said finally. I thought you deserved to hear it from me directly. Caroline looked at him for a long moment. At the strong line of his jaw, still handsome at 36. At the carefully pressed coat he wore even at this hour, because Oliver Kingsley always wanted to appear as a man of consequence. At the hands that had touched her face once years ago, in a moment of tenderness, she had replayed more times than she cared to admit. She picked up the wedding portrait again. 8 years, she said. I gave you 8 years, not because I had no other choice, not because my family required it of me. She set the portrait face down on the table. I stayed because I believed in this marriage. I believed that eventually you would see me. Caroline. I spent 8 years waiting for you to see me, Oliver. Her voice did not shake. She was surprised by that. I will not spend one more day in that particular occupation. Oliver stared at her. He had expected tears. She could read it in his face, the faint, uncomfortable surprise of a man who had prepared for a storm and encountered instead a door quietly closing. He had expected to spend this evening managing her distress. He had expected to feel guilty, and perhaps also slightly relieved, and perhaps also, if she was honest with herself about the kind of man Oliver Kingsley was, a small, shameful part of him had expected to feel flattered, to feel wanted even in his leaving, to feel like a man so desirable that losing him caused visible devastation. Caroline gave him none of it. You may take the eastern guest room tonight, she said. I will have Mrs. Pettigrew prepare your bag for the morning. Caroline, There is nothing more to say tonight, Oliver. She walked past him toward the hallway. She did not run. She did not hurry. She walked at the measured pace of a woman who has somewhere to be, and she kept her back straight, and she did not once look behind her. She sat in the small reading room at the end of the corridor for a long time after that. The reading room was hers, the only space in the vast house that Oliver had never appropriated, never wandered into uninvited. It held her books, her correspondence, the small writing desk where she managed accounts in the early mornings before the household woke. A single oil lamp. A chair she had reupholstered herself because the original fabric had been an irritating shade of mustard. She sat in that chair and looked at her hands. They were steady. That surprised her too. She had been so certain in the abstract imagining of this moment that it would destroy her. For months she had felt the cold advance of something wrong in the marriage, the way Oliver's eyes traveled past her at dinner, the way his attentiveness never strong had thinned to near transparency, the way he found reasons to be away and increasingly forgot to invent plausible ones. She had built up the anticipation of this confrontation like a woman bracing for a fall from height. But she had landed, and she was upright, and her hands were steady. She thought about the estate. She thought about the tenant Amos Greer, who had come to her 3 years ago with a broken drainage system that was ruining his barley crop, and how she had arranged the repair without bothering Oliver, because Oliver would have viewed it as an unnecessary expense. Amos Greer's farm had since become one of the most productive on the Kingsley land. He had named his second daughter Caroline. She thought about Merchant Alderton of Leeds, who had tried to renegotiate a wool contract in his favor and found to his visible shock that the woman across the table from him understood market prices, transport costs, and contract law better than he did. The renegotiation had gone in Kingsley Estate's favor. She thought about the winter 2 years ago, when Oliver had been ill for 6 weeks, and she had run everything, all of it, every decision, every dispute, every account, and not a single thing had faltered. Not one. Oliver had recovered from that illness and returned to his responsibilities without ever fully appreciating what those responsibilities had consisted of in his absence. Caroline had not told him. What would have been the point? She sat in the reading room until the lamp began to gutter, and then she trimmed it, and she sat a little longer. Her family's estate in Harrowdale was empty. Had been empty for 2 years since her mother passed. It was smaller than Kingsley Manor, considerably smaller, and it had its own set of neglected accounts and deferred repairs. But it was hers. Held in her name through her mother's will, which Oliver had never contested because he had not thought it worth contesting. He had not imagined she would ever need it. He had not imagined she would ever leave. That, she supposed, was the great failure of his imagination. She told the household the next morning. Not in the way of a woman in crisis. She called Mrs. Pettigrew, the housekeeper, into the sitting room, and she was direct. "Mr. Kingsley will be departing for London this morning. I will be departing for Harrowdale within the week. The household will operate under your management until further arrangements are made." Mrs. Pettigrew, a woman of 60, who had seen generations of Kingsley drama and wore her composure like armor, absorbed this with a single slow blink. "Yes, ma'am. Will you require a formal letter to the solicitors?" "I will require several formal letters. I will prepare them myself." "Of course, ma'am." A pause. "Mrs. Pettigrew." Caroline met the older woman's eyes. "I want you to know the accounts are in order. Better than order. Everything has been logged and annotated through the end of the year. Whoever manages them next should have no difficulty." Something moved across Mrs. Pettigrew's face. Not quite sadness. Something more complicated. "We have known that for years, ma'am," she said quietly. "Some of us more than others." Caroline nodded once, and that was all, and Mrs. Pettigrew left to arrange things. Oliver departed at 9 in the morning. Caroline watched from the upstairs window, not hidden, not crouching behind the curtain, like a woman in a novel, simply standing at the glass and watching with the clear-eyed assessment of someone observing a fact rather than living a tragedy. His carriage was well appointed. He had always cared about appearances. He did not look up at the windows. She had not expected him to. She spent the next 4 days in systematic preparation. She audited every account in the estate's ledgers and prepared a comprehensive summary with marginal notes that any moderately intelligent person could follow. She wrote letters to 7 merchants, 3 tenant representatives, and 2 solicitors. She catalogued the library. She arranged the transfer of certain personal items, her books, her writing tools, the embroidered cushion her mother had made, the small silver inkwell she had purchased herself from a market in Harrogate 3 years ago, because it had pleased her, and she had needed in that season to do something that simply pleased her. She did not weep. Not once. On the 5th morning she wept. Not dramatically. She was not a dramatic woman by nature, and she had no audience and no interest in performing grief, even privately. She sat at the writing desk in the reading room and let the tears come for approximately 20 minutes, and she breathed through them, and when they were done, she washed her face and returned to her correspondence. That was the grief she permitted herself. 20 minutes. The length of a morning ablution. Then she packed the last of her things. The journey to Harrowdale took most of a day. Her coachman, Thomas, had been with the family since Caroline was a girl. He said nothing about the circumstances of her departure. He handled the horses with his usual unhurried competence and stopped twice to water them and once to allow Caroline to walk briefly along the road's edge because she had asked, and he had never refused her a reasonable request in 20 years. The Yorkshire countryside rolled past the carriage windows. Late autumn had stripped the trees to their bones and laid the fields bare, the hedgerows, brown and patient, the stone walls running up the hillsides in long, irregular lines that had been built by hands now 200 years gone. She had always loved this country, even in its sternest season. The estate at Harrowdale was smaller than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply grown accustomed to the scale of Kingsley Manor and forgotten what ordinary proportions looked like. The house was a solid Georgian build, not grand, not struggling. Simply solid, the kind of house that had been built to last by people with sense rather than ambition. The gardens had gone wild in the 2 years of vacancy. The gate at the east end had a loose hinge she could hear before Thomas had fully stopped the carriage. She stood in the doorway of the house for a moment. It smelled of closed rooms and damp and the ghost of her mother's rosewater, which was irrational but real nonetheless. "Well," she said to no one in particular. Then she stepped inside and began to assess what needed doing. The village of Harrowdale itself was a 30-minute walk from the house, and within a week of Caroline's arrival, she had walked it twice. She was not a woman who hid. She had never been a woman who hid. Whatever the whispers were, and she was not naive enough to imagine there were no whispers. In a Yorkshire village of 400 souls, there were always whispers. She would not retreat from them. The whispers, as it turned out, were more sympathetic than she anticipated. Harrowdale remembered her. She had grown up running through the lanes of this village, had bought ribbons at Mrs. Alton's dry goods shop, and learned to ride at the Fenwick farm, and attended church in the stone chapel on the hill through every Sunday of her childhood. The village had watched her leave as a bride. The village had watched her mother age and decline without a daughter nearby. The village, it appeared, had formed opinions about Oliver Kingsley based on the evidence of that absence. Margaret Alton. Mrs. Alton now, having inherited the shop from her mother, pressed 3 yards of good wool into Caroline's hands upon her first visit and refused payment. "It's cold coming," Margaret said firmly, "and you'll need your coat seen to before winter sets in properly." "Margaret, I have to pay you. You can pay me in the spring when the accounts are sorted." The woman's eyes were direct and simultaneously the way a woman's eyes can be when she has known you since you were small and seen you grow into something sturdier than you yourself realize. "And you'll have no trouble sorting them. You never did." That mattered more than Caroline expected. Being known, being remembered as capable rather than as a woman to be pitied. The first man to come to her with a business matter was Robert Fenwick, who ran the largest farm in the Harrowdale Valley, and who had apparently been waiting with some impatience for the return of someone with both authority over the Wentworth land and the ability to make rational decisions about it. He appeared at the house on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after her arrival. Hat in hand, a large man of 50, with the patient expression of someone who had been dealing with inconvenient situations for decades. "Mrs. Kingsley." "Miss Wentworth," she said, "for the duration." He accepted this without comment. "There's a drainage question on the north field that's been waiting 2 years for an answer. Your mother, God rest her, never had the inclination to deal with it, and your husband." He stopped. "Apologies, ma'am. My husband was never consulted on Harrowdale matters and is no longer my concern. Tell me about the drainage." He told her about the drainage. She asked 12 questions. He answered 11 of them immediately and went away to retrieve the answer to the 12th, which he brought back the following morning, along with a revised proposal. They reached an agreement within the week. The work began immediately because the ground was not yet fully frozen, and Fenwick was a man who did not permit perfectly good conditions to go to waste. Word traveled. The Wentworth woman was back. The Wentworth woman was sharp. The Wentworth woman was making decisions. Caroline noticed the shift in the way people spoke to her when she walked through the village. Less the careful, buffered sympathy of women talking to a woman in difficulty. More the direct address of people speaking to someone who might be useful. She preferred the latter enormously. Meanwhile, and Caroline knew this only through the letter that arrived on the 23rd of November, written in the careful hand of Mrs. Pettigrew, who had an old-fashioned sense of duty that overrode any hesitation about the appropriateness of writing things at Kingsley Estate, were not proceeding smoothly. Mrs. Pettigrew's letter was restrained, as Mrs. Pettigrew's letters always were. But between the careful lines, the accounts she had organized so meticulously were not being properly maintained. 2 merchants had already written to question unpaid invoices. Tenant Greer had submitted a complaint about a fence dispute that was sitting unanswered on Oliver's desk in London. A delivery of timber for a necessary barn repair had not been authorized, and the barn was now exposing livestock to weather that had turned sharply cold. Oliver apparently had not yet returned from London. Caroline read the letter twice. She did not feel satisfaction. She did not feel vindication. She felt a complicated, tired sadness for the estate itself, for the land, the farms, the people who depended on it, and then she folded the letter and went to answer the 3 letters of her own that had been waiting since morning. She could not manage Kingsley Estate from Harrowdale. It was not hers to manage anymore. But Harrowdale was hers, and it was waiting, and it needed her, and that was enough. Henry Beaumont entered her life the way most consequential things entered sideways, without announcement when she was thinking about something else entirely. She was in the lane behind the chapel, arguing cheerfully with a stone wall. More precisely, she was arguing with the gate in the stone wall, which had apparently decided that it would not open today, and possibly not any other day, and she had her shoulder against it, and was applying reasonable force and saying several things under her breath that were not quite unladylike, but were heading in that direction. "The latch is broken," a voice said. She turned. The man on horseback was perhaps 40, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had clearly been handsome in its youth and had settled into something more interesting with age. He wore a riding coat of good quality, without ostentation, and he was looking at the gate with the particular expression of a man identifying a problem he might actually do something about. "I know the latch is broken," Caroline said. "I intended to speak to someone about it. You could lift the gate slightly off its hinge while pushing." He swung down from his horse with the practiced ease of a man who spent time outdoors. "May I?" She stepped aside. He did exactly as he had described, lifted the gate, fractionally applied even pressure, and it swung open with no complaint whatsoever. "Ah," she said, "Henry Beaumont." He extended his hand without any of the usual social hesitation, as though it was simply obvious that a man introduced himself to a woman he had just helped, rather than waiting for some elaborate intermediary process. "I manage the Beaumont land to the north. We share a border with the Wentworth property." Caroline Wentworth. She shook his hand because he offered it, and she saw no reason not to. "I have recently returned to manage the estate. I know." He picked up his horse's reins. "Mrs. Fenwick mentioned it. She said you had already sorted the Northfield drainage question that has been causing Robert grief for 2 years. It was not a complicated solution. It only required someone to commit to making a decision." He looked at her with an expression she recognized slowly, because she was not accustomed to receiving it genuine interest. Not the polite interest of social obligation. Not the appraising interest of a man calculating her position in the local hierarchy. Actually interested. "Robert has been trying to get someone to make that decision since your mother's health declined," Beaumont said. "He said the woman who finally sorted it did it in 1 conversation. 2 conversations. I needed information on the second." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Very nearly a smile. "Kingsley's loss," he said. Not unkindly. Simply as a statement of fact, the way a man states the weather or the price of grain. Caroline looked at him steadily. "Indeed," she said. She walked through the gate and let it close behind her. He appeared at her door the following week with a question about a property boundary that had apparently been a source of ambiguity between the Beaumont and Wentworth estates for some years. He was correct that it needed resolution. He was also, she noticed, prepared for the conversation in a way that suggested he had done actual research beforehand. He brought the relevant survey documents organized chronologically with the disputed section marked in clear notation. She brought out her own documents, which she had located in the house's study, where they had been sitting in reasonable order, and they spent 2 hours at the dining table, working through the question with the methodical concentration of two people who actually wanted to solve a problem rather than win an argument. They solved it. She offered tea. He accepted without performance. "You managed Oliver Kingsley's estate," he said over the tea. Not as a question. "I did." "For how long?" "7 of our 8 years together. The first year I was learning." Beaumont absorbed this. He had the quality rare in her experience of actually absorbing information rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. And he did not appreciate that. He did not see it. There is a distinction. She set down her cup. A man who does not appreciate something knows it exists. Oliver genuinely did not see it. I was the furniture of his life, permanent, useful, taken entirely for granted. Until you weren't. Until I left. He looked at her, directly, not obtrusively. "Do you regret it?" The question surprised her, not its boldness, but its specificity. He was not asking if she regretted the marriage. He was asking about the leaving. "No," she said. "Not the leaving." He nodded once. "I was married," he said. 7 years. She died of fever. It was—" He stopped, started again. "She was a remarkable woman. I have not been inclined to repeat the experience. Of marriage, or of being considered exceptional." That faint, almost imperceptible smile appeared again. "Perhaps both," she answered softly. "At least that was true until not long ago." The quiet that followed did not feel awkward or forced. That was what made it so unusual. Most moments of silence between people needed to be filled, guided, or carefully controlled. This one needed none of that. It remained untouched, peaceful, and natural, exactly as silence was meant to be. "So you intend to remain in Harrowdale," he finally said. "Not just for a while, but for good." "I intend to." She said it clearly, with the confidence of a woman who has had the decision settled in herself for weeks. "This estate needs management. The village needs well. It needs someone present. My mother was ill for 2 years. There are gaps. You have been filling them for 3 weeks and people are already talking about it." "People talk about everything." "They talk about this with admiration," he said. "That is different." Caroline looked at him. In 8 years of marriage, she had kept the accounts and managed the crises and held the estate together in ways that only Mrs. Pettigrew had ever truly observed, and admiration had not entered into the equation once. The word landed with a weight she had not anticipated. She picked up her teacup. "Will you have more tea, Mr. Beaumont?" He held out his cup. "Thank you, Miss Wentworth." She received another letter from Mrs. Pettigrew at the end of November. Oliver had returned from London. He had found the accounts in disorder, not her doing, but the accumulated disorder of 6 weeks of neglect, and he had spent 4 days attempting to understand the mess before apparently concluding that he could not. He had sent for the solicitors. The solicitors. Mrs. Pettigrew wrote with the carefully neutral prose of someone describing a fire without wishing to appear to enjoy it, had told Oliver Kingsley several things he had apparently not known. About the extent of the debt management she had performed in the early years. About the merchant negotiations. About the tenant contracts and how they had been restructured. About the drainage improvements and the barn repairs and the timber agreements and the 30 or 40 other things that had constituted the invisible architecture of the estate's survival. The solicitors had been, Mrs. Pettigrew wrote, quite thorough. Oliver's response, Mrs. Pettigrew did not include. But she had included one sentence that required no elaboration. "Mr. Kingsley asked for your address in Harrowdale. I was not aware of any obligation to provide it without your permission, and so I have not done so." Caroline sat with that letter for a long time. Then she wrote back, thanking Mrs. Pettigrew warmly, and she enclosed with the letter a small sum that represented a Christmas bonus she had forgotten to arrange before leaving, because it was already December, and Mrs. Pettigrew had served the family faithfully for 30 years, and deserved to be remembered. She did not include the address, not because she was hiding. She simply was not ready. Not ready to look at Oliver Kingsley's face and see what was there which was not. She suspected love and might not even be genuine regret, but was almost certainly the dawning comprehension of a man discovering that the thing he discarded was the thing that held everything else together. She was not ready to be that particular lesson. She was too busy being Caroline Wentworth. And the north field drainage was holding beautifully, and Margaret Alton had mended her winter coat with excellent workmanship, and Henry Beaumont had left a note formal but warm asking if she might be willing to consult on a tenant matter that touched the boundary of their shared property line. She wrote back the same afternoon. She was available Thursday. The year turned. 1817 came in cold and clear, the Yorkshire hills rigid with frost. The sky at dawn, a particular shade of pale that she had loved since childhood, that steel-blue promise before the sun arrived properly. She stood at the garden gate on the morning of the new year and breathed it in. Behind her, the house was coming back to itself. A room repainted, the east window reglazed, the kitchen organized to her preferences rather than to the drifted habits of a household that had lost its organizing intelligence 2 years ago. She had planted bulbs in October in a corner of the garden that had gone to weeds, and they were beneath the frozen ground now waiting. She had planted things and was waiting for them to grow. This, she thought, was a reasonable way to begin a year. She could not have predicted that before spring arrived, Oliver Kingsley would appear at her gate with the particular expression of a man who has finally understood something that should have been obvious years ago. She could not have predicted the shape the season would take. But she was standing upright in the January frost, and her hands were steady, and she was not waiting for anyone. That was enough for now. That was more than enough. Thursday arrived with a hard frost that cracked the puddles in the lane and turned the breath of horses into small white clouds, and Caroline Wentworth was already at her writing desk by 7 in the morning with 3 letters drafted and the Harrowdale account ledger open beside her inkwell. She had slept 6 hours. She had not dreamed of Oliver once. That in itself felt like a kind of progress. Henry Beaumont arrived precisely at 10, which she noted because imprecision in time was something she had learned through Oliver's years of casual lateness to find genuinely irritating. Beaumont knocked at the front door, rather than sending a card, a directness she approved of, and when Caroline's housekeeper, old Nan, who had worked the Wentworth property since Caroline's childhood, showed him into the sitting room, he was carrying a leather satchel and the expression of a man who had actually thought about what he needed to discuss before arriving to discuss it. "Miss Wentworth, thank you for making time." "Sit down, Mr. Beaumont. Nan will bring tea. Tell me about the tenant question." He opened the satchel and laid 3 documents on the table between them, with the organized efficiency of a man who understood that other people's time mattered. The question was this: a tenant named William Brace, whose farm sat precisely on the boundary between Beaumont land and Wentworth land, had been paying a divided rent to 2 estates for 11 years, based on a survey that Beaumont believed, and now had some documentary evidence to support, was incorrectly drawn. "If the original survey is wrong," Caroline said, pulling the oldest document toward her, "Brace has been paying for land that may not be under the jurisdiction he thinks it is, either overpaying one estate or underpaying another, possibly both." Beaumont watched her read. "I wanted another set of eyes before I took it to the solicitors. You know the Wentworth survey documents better than anyone, and Brace is a good man who has farmed that land for 20 years without complaint. I would like to resolve this in his favor if the evidence supports it." Caroline looked up from the document. "In his favor," she repeated. "He is a tenant farmer who has paid honest rent for 11 years on the basis of a line someone drew incorrectly in 1806. It seems reasonable that he should not be penalized for the error." She looked at him for a moment. There was nothing performative in the statement. He was not trying to impress her with his magnanimity. He was stating what he considered obvious. "Let me get the Wentworth survey," she said, and she was already moving toward the study before he had a chance to respond. She returned with 2 documents. They spread all 5 across the table and spent 45 minutes working through them with the kind of focused, practical concentration that Caroline had always found deeply satisfying the work of making sense of something that had been allowed to be confused for too long. The original survey was indeed wrong, by approximately 30 yards. "Brace has been paying a portion of his rent to Kingsley Estate," Caroline said, slowly tracing the line with her finger. For land that is by every correct measurement, Beaumont land. Yes. For 11 years. Yes. She sat back. The implications settled around the table like cold air. Then Kingsley Estate owes William Brace 11 years of overpayment. Or Kingsley Estate owes Beaumont Estate 11 years of misdirected rent, and Beaumont will compensate Brace directly. He paused. The second path involves fewer legal complications. And it costs you money. It costs me money that was never correctly mine to begin with. Caroline studied him. In her experience, men of property did not typically approach these situations this way. They approached them with layers of qualification and self-interest dressed up as principle. Henry Beaumont was sitting at her dining table, proposing to absorb a financial loss in order to correct an injustice to a tenant farmer, and he was doing it without drama, as though it were simply the obvious right thing to do, and the discussion was only about mechanism. "You will need a letter from me confirming the Wentworth Estates agreement with this resolution," she said. "If you're satisfied, the documents support it." "I am satisfied." She pulled a fresh sheet of paper from the stack at the edge of the table. "I will write it now." He watched her write without speaking. When she finished and sanded the ink, she slid it across the table. He read it, nodded once. "Efficient," he said. "I dislike leaving things to accumulate." The almost smile. It was becoming familiar to her, that particular expression, the way the corner of his mouth moved before the rest of his face committed to anything. "I've noticed," he said. Nan brought the tea. They drank it. The conversation moved with the natural drift of two people who have finished the work they came to do and find they are not quite ready to stop talking, from the boundary question to the condition of the roads in the valley, which were dreadful, and from the roads to the question of who in the county had the authority to authorize their repair, which was apparently a matter of considerable ongoing dispute. "Lady Ashworth in the West argues it is the county magistrate's purview," Beaumont said. "The magistrate argues it is the landowner's collective responsibility." Meanwhile, the road between Harrowdale and Kettleridge has 3 potholes large enough to swallow a wheel. "I went through one of them last week." "How is the wheel?" "Repaired, at my expense." She set down her cup. "I have been thinking of writing to the magistrate directly." "Have you met Hargreave?" "Not yet. He responds better to written argument than to personal persuasion. He is a man who likes to feel that he reached the correct conclusion himself." A pause. "If you write the letter framing the road repair as an economic efficiency measure rather than a civic obligation, he will approve it within a fortnight and believe it was his own idea." Caroline stared at him. "That is a remarkably strategic observation." "I have lived in this county for 15 years. You are telling me how to manage a man's vanity. I am telling you how to get the road fixed." The almost smile arrived fully this time. "The methods are not always separable." She laughed. It came out before she decided to permit it a real laugh, not the polished social variety she had deployed throughout 8 years of Kingsley dinner parties. It surprised her. It seemed to surprise him too, though pleasantly. "I will write the letter your way," she said, "and if it works, I will be very annoyed at how well it works." He stood to go, gathering the documents back into the satchel. At the door he paused. "The Harrowdale Assembly is the last Friday of January. I expect you know." "I have been informed." "I will be there. If you find yourself without a partner for the first set—" He stopped. Not awkwardly. Simply leaving it incomplete on purpose, as an offer rather than a presumption. "I will bear that in mind," she said. He left. She stood at the window and watched him mount his horse, clean, economical movements, nothing wasted, and turn out of the lane. Then she went back to her desk and wrote the letter to the magistrate exactly the way Henry Beaumont had suggested. The letter worked in 10 days. The magistrate approved the road repair in a response so enthusiastic it bordered on self-congratulatory, taking full credit for the initiative in language that would have made a lesser woman furious and made Caroline deeply helplessly amused. She folded the letter and set it on her desk and thought about Henry Beaumont for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then she answered her other correspondence and did not think about it again. Or told herself she didn't. The assembly came on the last Friday of January, as promised, held in the Harrowdale Town Hall, which was a stone building that had hosted the village's formal gatherings for 60 years and smelled pleasantly of beeswax and old wood. Caroline arrived with Margaret Alton, who had appointed herself Caroline's social companion for the evening, with the cheerful authority of a woman who had decided something and seen no reason to seek permission. "You need to be seen," Margaret said as they hung their cloaks. "Not lurking, seen, standing upright and looking like the woman who got the Kettle Ridge Road repaired." "I did not get the road repaired." The magistrate. "Everyone knows who wrote the letter." Margaret patted her arm. "News travels in Harrowdale. It always has." The assembly hall was warm with bodies and candlelight and the sound of the fiddle tuning in the corner. Caroline recognized most of the faces' old names, childhood names, people she had known in one form and now re-encountered in their adult configurations. She navigated 3 conversations in rapid succession. The Fenwick family asking after the Northfield drainage. A woman named Mrs. Porterhouse, inquiring about whether she intended to rent the smaller Wentworth cottage, and old Dr. Marsh, who simply took both her hands and said, "We are glad you're back, my dear," in the voice of a man who had delivered her into the world and felt entitled to say what he thought. She was in the middle of reassuring Mrs. Porterhouse about the cottage. Yes, she was considering rentals, yes, she would send a note by the end of the week when she became aware that Henry Beaumont had arrived. She knew because the quality of Margaret's attention shifted. Margaret was a woman with a finely calibrated social radar. "Mr. Beaumont," Margaret said, looking just past Caroline's shoulder. "How was crossing the room?" He had the unhurried quality of a man comfortable in his own skin, not working the room the way some men did, circulating with strategic purpose. He was simply moving in her general direction, as though it were the obvious thing to do. "Miss Wentworth." He bowed slightly correct without being stiff. "Mrs. Alton." "Mr. Beaumont." "I hear the road business is sorted," Margaret said with the transparent enjoyment of a woman who thoroughly enjoyed knowing things. "So I understand." Remarkable what can be accomplished with the right letter. Margaret looked between them. "I must just go and speak to Mrs. Porterhouse. You will excuse me." She did not go immediately to Mrs. Porterhouse. She went in the direction of Mrs. Porterhouse via a route that took her past several other people she needed to speak to urgently, leaving Caroline and Beaumont standing beside the wall with the fiddle now playing properly and the first set assembling on the floor. "The road letter worked," Caroline said. 10 days. You must have framed it well." "I framed it exactly as you suggested." "And you are annoyed at how well it worked." "Deeply." She looked at the dancers gathering. "I have written 100 letters in my life on behalf of the Kingsley estate. Not once did I think to calculate for the recipient's vanity rather than the strength of the argument." "The strength of the argument matters," he said. "The vanity is simply the door you walk through to make the argument." She considered that. "That is either wisdom or cynicism. I cannot decide which." "Both probably. They're not exclusive." The first notes of the set began. He turned to her with the same directness he had shown at the broken gate at the dining table at every point of their acquaintance, not performing a request, simply making one. "Will you dance?" She took his hand. She had not danced in 3 years. The last time had been at the Brentwood Assembly, the winter before Oliver began his London habit, before the absences became regular, before she began to understand the texture of what was happening. She had danced at Brentwood with Oliver beside her performing the steps, and at some point between the second and third set, she had looked at her husband's face in the candlelight and understood with the quiet precision of a woman who has been honest with herself for a very long time that he was not thinking about her. She did not know what he was thinking about. She had not known then. She knew now. She supposed that the habit of a woman named Miss Hartwell had already been forming in his imagination while his feet went through the correct motions beside his wife. She did not think about that now. She thought about the count of the steps and the warmth of Henry Beaumont's hand and the fact that she was laughing again, laughing at something he said as they turned something dry, and precisely observed about the expression on the magistrate's face when he accepted public praise for the road initiative he had initially resisted for 3 months. He was a good dancer. Not showy. precise and easy the way he did most things. Between the second and third set, she found herself standing beside him at the edge of the floor, slightly out of breath, and she thought, this is what it is supposed to feel like. Not necessarily this man, this room, but the ease. The absence of calculation. The sense that she was not managing anything. She had spent 8 years managing everything, including her own emotions. She had not realized until this moment, breathing beside a man who asked her questions and waited for the answers, how exhausting that perpetual management had been. February arrived and brought a letter she had been half expecting. It was addressed to Miss C. Worth, Harrowdale Estate, Yorkshire, in handwriting she recognized without needing to see the seal Oliver's. She set it on the writing desk and left it there for 2 hours while she attended to other things. Not because she was afraid of it. Because she was disciplined, and discipline meant not allowing a letter to rearrange the order of your morning simply because it arrived. She opened it at 11 when she had intended to open it with the account ledger still spread beside her and a cup of tea that Nan had brought without being asked, because Nan had been reading Caroline's habits for 20 years. Caroline. I have been speaking with Alderton and the other merchants. I have spoken with the solicitors. There are things I did not understand about the management of the estate. Things I did not understand about what you did. I am writing because I cannot. He had crossed out several words here. I am writing because I owe you an accounting. Several accountings, in fact, of the literal and figurative variety. The estate is in difficulty, not crisis. I want to be clear about that. But difficulty that I did not anticipate. I would like to speak with you. Not about returning. I understand that is not. I am not asking that. I am asking for the opportunity to tell you that I am sorry. Properly sorry. In person. If you will allow it. Oliver. Caroline read the letter twice. Then she put it in the desk drawer and turned back to the ledger. She was not ready. She knew she was not ready because the letter did not make her angry. She had expected anger, and it did not make her sad in the way she had expected sadness. It made her tired. The tired that comes not from exertion, but from something having been long finished and the evidence of it still requiring processing. She wrote back 4 days later. Oliver, I have received your letter. I am not prepared for the conversation you are requesting. Not yet. I will write when I am. Caroline Short. Direct. Neither cruel nor warm. The letter of a woman who was no longer performing anything for anyone. She sent it with the Morning Post and went out to walk the North Field with Robert Fenwick, who wanted to show her the results of the drainage work in its first real test after a week of heavy rain. The field was holding perfectly. I told you, she said. Fenwick had the grace to look pleased rather than surprised. The second letter from Oliver arrived 3 weeks after the first. She had half expected him to come in person, and she had prepared herself for that. The sound of carriage wheels. The knock at the door. The necessity of deciding in real time how to receive him. But he wrote instead, and she wondered if he had the sense to understand that showing up unannounced would be a repetition of the old pattern, arriving when it suited him and expecting to be accommodated. This letter was longer, more careful, as though he had written it several times and arrived at this version after considerable revision. He had been to see the solicitors again. He had a full accounting now, a true accounting of everything Caroline had done for the estate in 8 years. Not just the obvious things, the things he had not seen, the specific decisions, the negotiations, the numbers, how much debt she had eliminated, how many contracts she had restructured, the actual monetary value of what her management had represented. The figure he wrote was somewhat arresting. She almost smiled at that. Somewhat arresting. That was Oliver at his most honest, not quite able to commit fully to the size of the admission. I told myself for a long time that ours was a practical marriage, that we understood each other and what the arrangement was. I think now that I told myself this in order to avoid examining what I actually owed you and what I was not giving. She is gone. Miss Hartwell. She left when the estate's income became uncertain. I am not. I tell you this, not to seek your sympathy, but because you deserve to know the full picture. I made my choice based on nothing. I lost everything based on everything. I do not expect you to come back. I am not certain I would deserve it if you offered. But I would like you to know that I am sorry. Not for myself, for what I wasted." Caroline sat with that letter for a long time. She thought about the 20-years-old woman in the wedding portrait. She thought about the night Oliver stood beside the fireplace with his traveling bag and said the words he had rehearsed. She thought about the reading room with the oil lamp and her own steady hands. She thought about what it had cost her to build steadiness out of devastation, and how long that building had taken, and how it was still in progress. And she thought very briefly, because it was not a thought she needed to stay inside for long, that Oliver's letter was full of something real. Not enough. Not close to enough. But real. She put it in the drawer with the first letter and closed the drawer. She told Henry Beaumont about it eventually, not immediately. They had developed over the winter a habit of meeting on Thursday mornings on whatever practical matter most recently required attention: a question of the shared fence line, a decision about water rights in the spring, melt the ongoing saga of the Harrowdale-Kettle Ridge Road, which continued to generate bureaucratic drama despite having been theoretically resolved. The practical matters gave the meetings shape. The conversation that surrounded the practical matters had become something else. She was not naive about what it was becoming. She was also, for the first time in a very long time, not managing it, not calculating, not deciding in advance what she would permit herself to feel, and then performing that permission with careful control. She told him about Oliver's letters on a Thursday in March, when the frost had finally broken, and there was a tentative warmth coming off the stone walls in the afternoon light. "He has written twice," she said, apologizing. Beaumont looked at her steadily. "For the marriage or for the leaving?" "Both, I think. He has discovered with considerable assistance from the solicitors exactly what I managed during our years together. He is finding the numbers somewhat clarifying." He considered his tea. "Is that what changed his understanding the numbers?" "I think the numbers gave him a language for it. Men like Oliver often need quantification before they can see something." "That's generous." "Not really. It is accurate. I stopped being generous with Oliver when he left." She said it without heat. "What I am now is honest." Beaumont set down his cup. "What are you going to do?" "About the letters." "About all of it." She looked at him. The question was layered. She understood all the layers, and he was asking it without pretense about what he meant by all of it. "I am going to continue exactly what I am doing," she said. "Managing my estate, writing letters to magistrates who need their vanity managed, watching the Northfield, getting the East Wing repainted before summer." A pause. "And answering my correspondence when I am ready to answer it, not before." He nodded. Not the nod of a man who accepts an answer because he has been deflected. The nod of a man who accepts an answer because it is a good answer. "Fair," he said simply. The third letter did not come from Oliver. It came from Mrs. Pettigrew, and it was not careful. For the first time in 30 years of correspondence, the housekeeper's handwriting had broken its own discipline. The letters slightly larger, the lines less. Even the sense of someone writing faster than usual. "Dear Mrs. Kingsley, forgive me, Miss Wentworth. I write because I believe you ought to know, though it is not my place, and I am aware of that. Mr. Kingsley has been quite unwell. Not physically, though he has lost weight and his color is poor. I mean in the other way. He is not managing well. He sits in the library in the evenings with the portrait. You know which one. He does not come down to dinner reliably. The staff are concerned. I am writing because I believe he is trying in his way. I do not know what that is worth to you. I suspect you know better than I do. With all respect and affection, E. Pettigrew." Caroline sat with that letter for a long time. The portrait. She knew which one. The one she had set face down on the table the night she told him to go. Something moved in her chest. Not the old love, she recognized that well enough to know this was different. Not grief exactly. Something more like the complicated tenderness you feel for a person you once knew very well. A person who made choices that broke things between you. A person who is now learning what those choices cost, and learning it alone. She did not write to Oliver that evening. but she wrote to Mrs. Pettigrew. Dear Mrs. Pettigrew, thank you for always and for this. Please see that he eats, not because I require it of you, because it is cold and people who do not eat properly in cold houses catch chills, and I will not have his foolishness become your problem on top of everything else. The Christmas sum I sent was insufficient. Please find enclosed what I should have sent in the first place. Do not argue with me about it. With genuine affection, C. Wentworth. She sealed the envelope and set it with the Morning Post. She did not feel soft about Oliver. She did not feel hard either. She felt clear. The way the air felt after rain. She could see what he was, what she had been, what the years between them had contained, and she could see all of it without the distortion of hope or the distortion of bitterness, because she was neither hoping nor bitter. She was simply here, alive, managing her land, writing her letters, becoming day by day more precisely herself. Spring came in the first week of April. The bulbs she had planted in October came up in the corner of the garden she had cleared of weeds. Not all of them. Some had failed to take but enough. Yellow and white standing in a row with the particular determination of things that have been waiting underground through a long winter and are done waiting now. She was in the garden when Henry Beaumont rode up the lane, which was unusual for a Thursday. He generally sent a note ahead. He dismounted at the gate and opened it correctly, lifting the frame off its damaged hinge with the easy familiarity of someone who has done it before. I have something to tell you, he said. Something in his tone made her turn fully from the garden. My sister is coming from London. She will be staying at Beaumont Hall through the summer. He paused. She would like to call on you. She has heard I may have spoken of you on occasion in correspondence. Caroline looked at him. On occasion. More than once, he admitted. What did you say? He met her eyes directly the way he always did, without deflection, without the sideways approach of a man uncertain of his ground. The truth, he said, that you are the most capable and clear-sighted person I have met in 15 years. That you make decisions the way other people breathe without wasted motion. That you laugh at exactly the things that deserve to be laughed at. He stopped. That I find myself looking for reasons to come to Harrowdale on days that are not Thursday. The garden was very still. Caroline looked at the man standing at her gate. This man who had come to her with organized documents and an honest question and a willingness to absorb a financial loss in order to do right by a tenant farmer. This man who had told her how to write a letter that would move a vain magistrate without telling her what to think. This man who had asked her to dance and listen to her answers, and never once in all their months of Thursday meetings made her feel like furniture. Your sister is welcome, she said finally. Tell her to come on a Thursday. We can have tea. The almost smile arrived fully without reservation for the first time. She will be glad to hear it. He turned to remount his horse. Mr. Beaumont. He looked back. The reasons you are finding to come to Harrowdale on non-Thursdays. She held his gaze. You need not manufacture them. A silence that required no filling. He nodded once the way he nodded at things that were settled. Then he rode out of the lane, and she stood in the garden with the spring bulbs at her feet, and for the first time in longer than she could precisely measure, the future did not feel like something to be endured. It felt like something she was building. Eleanor Beaumont arrived on a Thursday as requested, and she was nothing like what Caroline had expected. Caroline had prepared herself for a version of the careful social performance she had navigated throughout 8 years of Kingsley dinner parties, the measured pleasantries, the subtle assessment disguised as warmth, the particular way women of standing looked at other women to determine their precise position in the hierarchy before deciding how much genuine friendliness to extend. She had prepared herself for all of that, and had decided she would be polite and direct, and not particularly interested in performing anything. Eleanor Beaumont walked through the door of Harrowdale House, looked around the sitting room with frank curiosity, sat down without waiting to be formally invited to sit, and said, Henry has talked about you so much that I feel I already know you, which is either a very good sign or a slightly alarming one, and I haven't decided which. Caroline stared at her for a moment. Then she laughed. Eleanor was 34, dark-haired with her brother's directness, and a sharpness in her eyes that suggested she had spent considerable time observing the world and reaching her own conclusions about it. She had been widowed young 8 years ago. Henry had mentioned it briefly and had since managed her own affairs in London with what was apparently considerable competence and mild scandal, because a widow who managed her own affairs was always at least mildly scandalous to someone. "What has he told you?" Caroline asked, pouring the tea herself, because Nan had the afternoon off and she preferred it that way. "That you are the cleverest woman in the north of England, and that he finds reasons to ride to Harrowdale on days that are not Thursday." Eleanor accepted her cup. "He thinks I don't notice when he is being intentional about casual phrasing. I have been noticing since we were children. He told me he mentioned me in correspondence. He mentioned you in 4 letters, in succession, with increasing frequency of detail." Eleanor's expression was precisely calibrated to convey that she found this extremely interesting without quite saying so. "My brother has not mentioned anyone with that frequency since before his wife died." Caroline was quiet for a moment. "He has been a good friend," she said carefully. "Yes." Eleanor looked at her directly. "He is very good at being a good friend to people he has decided matter to him. The question is usually whether those people understand what that means coming from Henry." The sitting room held that statement for a moment. "What does it mean?" Caroline asked, "coming from Henry?" Eleanor smiled, and it was the genuine article, nothing diplomatic about it. "It means he has decided you are worth showing up for. That is not a small thing with him. He spent 5 years after Margaret died being very careful not to decide that about anyone." The name settled between them gently. Margaret, Henry's wife, the remarkable woman. "He loved her very much," Caroline said. "He did. And he is not a man who gives love lightly, which is why losing her—" Eleanor stopped, started again. "He closed a door after that, quite thoroughly. I watched him do it. He was still excellent company, still kind, still Henry. But that particular door—" She sipped her tea. "Until recently, it has been quite firmly shut." Caroline looked at the spring light coming through the window. Outside the garden she had cleared of weeds was coming fully into bloom, now more bulbs than she had expected, more survivors from that October planting. She had stopped being surprised by things that turned out stronger than anticipated. "I am not fully resolved," she said finally. "There are still things in motion. My husband and I—" The word husband felt strange in her mouth now, like clothing that no longer fit. "The legal arrangements are not complete, and I am not. I am still building something here. I am not finished building it." "I know," Eleanor said, and her voice was entirely without pressure. "I didn't come to push anything. I came because Henry is happy when he talks about you, and I haven't seen him happy in 5 years, and I wanted to meet the reason." A silence. "That is either very kind," Caroline said, "or entirely alarming." "Probably both," Eleanor agreed pleasantly. "They're not exclusive." Caroline looked at her. "Your brother says that." "I know. He got it from me." Eleanor stayed 3 weeks at Beaumont Hall, and in that time she called on Caroline 4 times, twice on Thursdays with Henry, twice on her own, on days that had nothing to do with property boundaries or drainage questions. On the second of Eleanor's solo visits, she brought news from London. Not gossip. Eleanor was not a woman who trafficked in gossip, or rather she distinguished carefully between gossip and information, and what she carried was the latter. "I was at the Hartwell Assembly in February," she said, "before I came north." Caroline's hands stilled on the teacup. "Miss Hartwell's family?" she asked evenly. "They have a place near Kensington. Her mother is well, social. The mother came to me directly, actually." Eleanor watched Caroline's face. Apparently the situation between Miss Hartwell and Oliver Kingsley has become somewhat public knowledge. Not in the way that makes people sympathetic to Miss Hartwell. "What happened?" "She left him." Eleanor paused. "When the news went around that Kingsley Estates' accounts were in difficulty, not ruin, but difficulty, she withdrew rather quickly. Her mother has been working to manage the narrative ever since." Caroline absorbed this in silence. She had known from Oliver's second letter that Miss Hartwell was gone. She had not known the circumstances were public. She had not known that London drawing rooms were discussing the dissolution of Oliver Kingsley's 3-month romance with the same avidity they discussed everything else. She thought about Oliver, not with satisfaction, with something considerably more complicated, a long, tired sadness for a man who had believed that admiration was the same as love, and was now learning in the most public and humiliating way possible that it was not. "How is he?" she asked. Eleanor looked at her with an expression that contained considerable respect. "Managing," she said carefully. "His name is still good. The estate is struggling but not beyond recovery from what people say. But he is—" she chose her words. "He came to the Ashworth dinner in March, and he looked like a man who had lost something and could not quite locate what it was." "He knows what he lost." "Yes, I think that may be the worst part." Caroline set down her cup. "I am going to write to him," she said. Not a question, not a declaration, simply a statement of something that had clarified over the past weeks the way mud settles in a stream after rain and the water runs clear. Eleanor nodded once. "I thought you might." She wrote the letter the next morning before the account ledger, before the correspondence pile, before Nan brought the tea. She wrote it in one draft. "Oliver, you have written twice, and I have answered once, and the silence since then has not been for lack of knowing what to say. It has been for lack of being ready to say it. I am ready now. I am not coming back to Kingsley Estate. I want to be plain about that, not cruel. What I built at Harrowdale over these months is mine, and it is the first thing in a long time that has been entirely mine, and I will not give it up. But I am also not your enemy. I was never your enemy, even when I had reason to be. You asked to speak with me in person. I will receive you at Harrowdale. Come on the 15th if you are able. Come in the afternoon. And come prepared to have an honest conversation. The kind we never managed to have in 8 years of marriage. I find I am no longer patient with performances. Caroline." She sealed it and handed it to Thomas before she could revise it into something more careful. The letter that was too careful was the letter that said nothing. Oliver Kingsley arrived on the 15th of April at 2:30 in the afternoon. Caroline heard the carriage from the study where she was working and did not go immediately to the window. She finished the line she was writing in the ledger, capped the inkwell, and walked to the entrance hall in her own time. Howe was thinner. Eleanor had said he looked like a man who had lost something, and it was a precise description. There was a quality to his face, standing in the doorway of Harrowdale House, of a man who had been relieved of something heavy and was still adjusting to the new way his body moved without the weight. He had his hat in his hands. His coat was good, but not ostentatious, which was different from how he had always dressed before. Oliver Kingsley had always dressed for consequence. "Caroline." His voice was careful. "Oliver, come in." She led him to the sitting room. The situation, with the economy of a woman who had been reading rooms for 60 years and departed to make tea without being asked. Oliver looked around the sitting room. He looked at the books on the shelves, the writing desk in the corner, the spring flowers in the window glass, simple ones from the garden, not the elaborate arrangements that had been his mother's tradition at Kingsley Manor. He looked at all of it with the expression of a man who is understanding something from evidence. "It suits you," he said quietly. "This house. It feels like you." "It is me. That is rather the point." He sat in the chair she indicated. She sat across from him. She did not perform warmth, and she did not perform coldness. She sat the way she had learned to sit at negotiating tables, present, still willing to wait. "I don't know where to begin," he said. "Begin at the thing you most need to say. Everything else can find its order after that." He looked at his hands, then at her. "I did not see you." The words were plain, not dressed in rhetoric, not qualified or cushioned. "No," she agreed. "You didn't." "I don't mean—" He stopped. Started again because Oliver Kingsley was whatever else. He was an intelligent man, and intelligence sometimes eventually reaches places that pride has been blocking for too long. "I don't mean I did not notice your presence. I mean I looked at you for 8 years and saw my wife and did not see you. The actual person. What you were doing. What you were." A pause. What I was failing to give you. Caroline was quiet. This was more than she had expected. Not in its emotion, she had expected some form of emotion from him. Even Oliver was not without feeling, but in its precision. He was not apologizing for leaving. He was apologizing for the 8 years before the leaving. That was a different and considerably more difficult admission. The solicitors showed you the accounts, she said. Yes. Something moved across his face. The actual figures, all of it. What you managed, what you recovered, what you built. He looked up. Do you know what Alderton said to me? I can imagine. He said, Mr. Kingsley, I assumed for years that you were a man of unusual financial intelligence. I now understand I was extending credit that belonged to your wife. Oliver's jaw tightened briefly. He said it without any cruelty. That almost made it worse. Alderton is a fair man. Hi is. A silence. Caroline, I had no idea. I want you to know, not as an excuse, because it is not an excuse, but I genuinely did not know. I thought you enjoyed the domestic management. I thought it was. You thought it was simply what happened, she said. You thought the estate survived because you were Oliver Kingsley, and things survived for men like you. He flinched. A small movement, but real. Yes, he said. That is yes. Exactly that. Nan brought the tea. There was a silence while the cups were arranged, and in that silence, Caroline watched Oliver's face and understood something she had not expected to understand. He was ashamed. Not the surface shame of a man caught in an embarrassing position. The deeper shame of a man who has examined himself honestly and found a picture he cannot make comfortable. That was not nothing. It was not enough. But it was not nothing. Miss Hartwell is gone, she said when Nan had left. Yes. Did you love her? He was quiet for a long moment. I loved how she made me feel, he said finally. I loved being looked at the way she looked at me. I confused those things with love because I had never. He stopped. Because you had never experienced being loved by someone who knew your actual self, Caroline finished. And so you did not know the difference. His eyes met hers. Is that what you were doing? He asked. Loving my actual self. For 8 years. Yes. The room was very still. I threw that away for 3 months of being admired by someone who loved my estate more than my person, he said. Not self-pityingly. As a statement of fact, the kind that lands with the weight of something finally seen clearly. She left in October, when the accounts became uncertain. She wrote me a letter that was. He shook his head. Very polite. She wished me well. I'm sorry, Caroline said. He looked at her. You are. I am sorry for the loss you thought you were choosing, she said precisely. I am not sorry that it ended, but I know what it is to understand that what you believed was one thing is actually something else. That clarity is painful even when it is necessary. Oliver looked at his cup. I came here expecting you to hate me, he said. I know. That would have been easier for you. Hatred is a conclusion. What I actually feel is more complicated and less comfortable for both of us. What do you actually feel? Caroline considered the question with the same seriousness she considered questions about drainage systems and merchant contracts, because it deserved seriousness. I feel clear, she said. I feel as though I have been standing in a room with poor light for 8 years and someone finally opened the window. I see you very well now, Oliver. I see what you are and what you are not, and I do not hate you, but I also do not mistake the view for something it isn't. Something in his face shifted. A long, slow exhale. I wanted to ask you to come back, he said. I wrote 7 drafts of a letter asking that. I burned all 7. Why? Because I realized each time I wrote it that I was asking you to come back to repair what I had broken. Not because I had earned you, because I needed you. His voice was quiet. And you spent 8 years being needed without being wanted. I could not ask you to repeat that. Caroline looked at the man across from her. This was Oliver at his best, and his best, she had always known, was genuinely decent. The tragedy of Oliver Kingsley was not that he was a bad man. It was that his best had come too late and too infrequently, and always in the wake of damage rather than before it. "You have not earned me," she said gently. "You are correct about that, and I am not coming back." He nodded. It cost him. She could see it cost him. "But I forgive you," she said. "Not for your sake, for mine. Because I do not wish to carry the weight of it." Oliver looked up. The expression on his face was something she did not have a precise word for. Not relief. Not happiness. Something older and quieter. The expression of a man receiving something he knows he does not deserve and cannot repay, and must simply accept with whatever grace he can manage. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me. Go home and manage your estate. The accounts are recoverable if you are disciplined." She paused. "I left detailed notes. The solicitors have them." He almost laughed. Not quite, but almost. "Of course you did," he said. He stayed 2 hours. They talked carefully, honestly, without the old patterns of him performing and her managing. They talked about the estate because Oliver genuinely needed guidance, and Caroline genuinely knew more about Kingsley's accounts than any solicitor. They talked about the merchant contracts that needed immediate attention, about the tenant fence dispute that had been sitting unanswered on his desk since October, about Amos Greer's farm and the drainage improvement that had made it the most productive on the land. Oliver listened. Actually listened without composing his response while she spoke. It occurred to her somewhere in the second hour that this was the most honest conversation they had ever had. 8 years of marriage had not produced 2 hours like this one. The distance between them, the legal papers being drawn up the miles between Yorkshire and the estate, the absolute clarity that she was not coming back, had made honesty possible in a way that proximity and obligation never had. That was perhaps the saddest thing, and also, in its way, the kindest. When he stood to leave, he held out his hand, old-fashioned formal, as though they were two people of business concluding an arrangement, which in some ways they were. She shook it. "Take care of Mrs. Pettigrew," she said. "She has been loyal to that house for 30 years. I know. He paused. "She refused to give me your address when I first asked. She wrote to you for permission." "I know. She is extraordinarily principled for a housekeeper." "She is extraordinarily principled for a person," Caroline corrected. "The occupation is irrelevant." He accepted this, put on his hat, walked to the door. At the door he stopped and turned back, and she saw it again, the expression she did not have a word for. "You are going to be extraordinary," he said. "You already are. I needed you to know that I see it. Finally. Even if it is too late." "It is too late," she agreed. "But I'm glad you see it." He left. She stood in the entrance hall for a moment after the carriage sounds faded. Then she walked back to the sitting room, picked up the teacup, found it cold, and carried it to the kitchen. She rinsed it herself, dried it, put it back on the shelf. Her hands were steady. Henry Beaumont appeared at the gate the following Thursday, with the correct lifting and pushing motion that had become by now simply the way one opened that particular gate, and Caroline was in the garden when he arrived and did not go inside. "Walk with me," she said. "I need to look at the east boundary before Fenwick comes tomorrow." He fell into step beside her without asking about the week, or about Oliver's visit, or about any of it. They walked the length of the east boundary, discussing the fence question that needed resolution before the spring planting made access difficult, and then they were at the far end of the property where the hill rose and the whole of the Harrowdale Valley was visible, and they stopped because it was the natural place to stop. "He came," Beaumont said, not a question. "He came. And we had the conversation we should have had years ago and never managed to." She looked at the valley. "I forgave him. I meant it. And I sent him home with notes on the merchant contracts." A pause. "That is very you," Beaumont said. "Is it forgiveness with a practical appendix?" "Yes." She looked at him. He was watching the valley too, with the patient attention of a man who was in no hurry and required nothing from the moment except the moment itself. "He said I was going to be extraordinary," she said. "He's right." "You say that very quickly for someone who doesn't know what he said." "I don't need to know what he said." Beaumont's voice was even unhurried, the voice of a man saying something he has known for a while and sees no reason not to say. I know what I see. I have known it since the first Thursday you pulled out 5 survey documents and sorted an 11-year legal question in 45 minutes. The wind moved across the hill. Below them the valley was green in the April light, the fields ordered and the stone walls running steady across the hills. Henry. She said his given name for the first time, and the fact of it settled naturally without ceremony. I need to tell you something. He turned to look at her. I am not finished building what I am building here, she said. I am not finished becoming who I am becoming, and I need that to be understood. Not as a barrier, as a fact. I understand it, he said immediately. I am not the woman who waited for Oliver Kingsley to see her. I am not going to be that woman for anyone else. I know. No one can ask me to step back from this. She gestured at the valley, the land, the house at the bottom of the hill. From any of this. Not even for something I want. He was looking at her steadily. Caroline. His voice was quiet. I am not asking you to step back from anything. I have never asked that. I have been showing up on Thursdays and asking your opinion about drainage and letting you correct my tenant contracts. A pause. I am asking to show up beside you, not instead of anything you are building, beside it. The valley was very quiet. Your sister thinks you have decided I matter, she said. My sister talks too much. She is correct, though. Yes. No qualification, no sideways approach, simply yes. Caroline looked at Henry Beaumont on the hill above the Harrowdale Valley. This man who organized his documents chronologically and told her how to move a magistrate without manipulating her, and opened broken gates with easy competence, and listened to her answers with the full attention of a man who actually wanted to know what she thought. I am going to need time, she said. I have time. I am going to make decisions you won't agree with, and I am not going to ask permission. I would find it alarming if you did. I am. She stopped, looked at him. I am not easy, Henry. I have been told I am too capable and too decided and not sufficiently dependent for a woman of my position. Who told you that? Oliver, on various occasions. He was quiet for a moment. Oliver, he said carefully, is a man who confused his wife's competence for a personality defect because it made him feel inadequate. His voice was even not unkind, simply accurate. You are not too capable. You are exactly as capable as you are. Those are not the same statement. Something loosened in Caroline's chest. A thing she had not known was still held tight. She breathed. Thursday then, she said. And sometimes not Thursday, he allowed. The almost smile was fully a smile now, and she had stopped finding it almost. Below them, the Harrowdale Valley lay green and patient in the April light, and the stone walls ran steady up the hills built by hands 200 years gone to last. The east fence needed attention before Fenwick came. The merchant letter needed drafting before the end of the week. The east wing still had one room that needed fresh plaster before she could properly call it finished. She had a great deal of building still to do. She turned back toward the house, and he walked beside her, and neither of them said anything more, because nothing more was needed, and that the comfort of that silence, the ease of it, the complete absence of the need to fill it, was its own kind of answer. They were halfway down the hill when Mrs. Pettigrew's letter arrived at the house, though Caroline would not read it until the following morning, and she would not understand immediately what it meant, and by the time she did, everything would have shifted again, because that was the nature of things half-built. They surprised you. Not always badly, but always completely. Mrs. Pettigrew's letter was not long. That was the first thing Caroline noticed when she opened it the following morning. The brevet, 3 short paragraphs from a woman who had always written with careful thoroughness, as though the housekeeper had started with more, and crossed most of it out before arriving at what she could actually bring herself to put on paper. Dear Miss Wentworth, I write with some urgency and ask your forgiveness for the imposition. Mr. Kingsley returned from Harrowdale yesterday evening in considerably better spirits than he has shown in months. I mention this only because what followed this morning makes the contrast more difficult to bear. A letter arrived by express from London. I do not know its full contents. I know only that Mr. Kingsley read it in the library and did not come out for 4 hours, and when he did, he told me to cancel all appointments for the remainder of the month and went upstairs. He has not come down since. I found the letter on the library floor. I did not read it, but I saw the signature before I set it face down on the desk. The name was Hartwell. I thought you ought to know. I do not know what it means. I am not certain Mr. Kingsley knows either. With respect, E. Pettigrew. Caroline read it twice. Then she set it on the desk beside the account ledger and looked at the wall for a moment. Hartwell. Miss Hartwell, who had left Oliver in October when the estate's income became uncertain. Miss Hartwell, whose mother had been managing a London narrative since the autumn. Miss Hartwell, who was 23 years old and had admired Oliver's wealth rather than his person, and had written him a very polite letter, wishing him well when the wealth became complicated. What could she possibly be writing now? Caroline thought about Oliver's face the previous afternoon when he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, thinner than she remembered wearing a coat without ostentation. She thought about the expression she had not had a word for the expression of a man receiving something he knew he did not deserve. She thought about him saying, "You are going to be extraordinary," and the way it had landed honest and too late, the way truth often arrives. She thought about him returning to Kingsley Estate yesterday evening in better spirits, and then reading a letter on the library floor and not coming out for 4 hours. She could ignore this. That was an option. The legal separation was progressing through the solicitors with steady bureaucratic momentum, and what Oliver Kingsley did in his library was increasingly not her concern, and that was correct. That was the right shape of things. She picked up her pen and wrote to Mrs. Pettigrew anyway. "Tell me what you know. All of it. I will not act on information I should not have, but I will not be kept in darkness about something that may yet affect my own arrangements." She sent it with the morning post and went about her day. The reply came in 48 hours, which meant Mrs. Pettigrew had been waiting for permission to tell everything and had the everything ready. It was 4 pages. The longest letter the housekeeper had ever written. Caroline read it at the writing desk with the door closed and Nan under strict instructions that she was not to be disturbed. The letter from Miss Hartwell's father, more precisely acting on Miss Hartwell's behalf, had contained a claim. Miss Hartwell was with child. She claimed Oliver was the father. She claimed the child had been conceived during the period of their association in the autumn of the previous year, and that she had only recently become certain of the fact and had written immediately upon confirmation. She was requesting through her father's formally worded language that Oliver Kingsley acknowledge the child and provide for its future, including the letter implied with the careful obliqueness of men who understood the power of implication over direct demand, the possibility of marriage. Mrs. Pettigrew had found out because Oliver had called for the solicitor at 7 in the morning, and the solicitor had been brought to the house in a state of some alarm, and Mrs. Pettigrew had 30 years of experience reading the temperature of a house by its sounds, and the sounds she had heard through the library door were the sounds of a man whose carefully rebuilt equilibrium had been entirely demolished. Caroline set the letter down. She sat very still. She was aware of several things occurring simultaneously in her mind, with the particular crowded efficiency of a woman who had learned to process difficult information without the luxury of falling apart. She was aware that this changed the legal situation in ways her solicitor needed to know immediately. She was aware that if Oliver married Miss Hartwell to acknowledge the child, the separation proceedings would need to be accelerated, rather than proceeding at their current unhurried pace. She was aware that Miss Hartwell's father was a man of social standing, and that the pressure being brought to bear was real and structured, and would not be easy for Oliver to withstand. And she was aware beneath all of that, quieter than all of that, the thing she did not examine too directly, because it was still too raw to touch, that she felt something for Oliver in this moment that she had not expected to feel. Not love. She knew the difference now between love and this. This was the feeling you had when someone you had once loved completely walked into a fire you had warned them about and burned. She wrote to her solicitor before she wrote back to Mrs. Pettigrew. The solicitor's name was Mr. Crane, and he was a small, precise man of 50 who had handled the Wentworth family's legal affairs for 20 years and who had received Caroline's decision to separate from Oliver Kingsley with the professionally neutral expression of a man who had formed a personal opinion he had no intention of sharing. He arrived at Harrowdale 2 days after her letter, which was fast. It meant he had understood the urgency. She laid out everything she knew. He listened with a pen moving steadily across his notepad. "This complicates your timeline," he said when she finished. "I know. How much? If Mr. Kingsley chooses to acknowledge the child and pursue marriage, the terms of your separation need to be finalized before any such marriage can occur. Currently, we have the property matters partially resolved and the financial settlement still in negotiation." He looked at his notes. "If Miss Hartwell's claim is legitimate, I have no evidence either way on that question. No. But if it is, Kingsley will be under considerable social pressure to act quickly, which means we must act quickly." He paused. "There is also the question of whether Miss Hartwell's father will use the separation proceedings as leverage. If it becomes publicly known that Kingsley was involved with this woman while still legally married to you. It is already known. Eleanor Beaumont told me the situation had reached the London drawing rooms before Christmas." Crane absorbed this with the expression of a man recalibrating. "Then the social damage to Kingsley is already done," he said slowly, "which removes some of Miss Hartwell's father's leverage because the scandal of the situation cannot be made worse by its exposure." He paused. "It does mean, however, that your name is part of the story. There is no version of these events that does not include you." "I am aware of that. Are you?" He stopped. Chose his words with the deliberateness of a man who knows he is navigating delicate ground. "How would you like your name to appear in that story, Miss Wentworth? That is within our power to shape to some degree." Caroline looked at him. "As a woman who managed her husband's estate for 8 years, separated from him with dignity when he made his choices, and has since built her own property into a respectable concern." She paused. "I will not be the tragic abandoned wife. I will not be the wronged woman. I will be what I am." Crane wrote something down. "That," he said without looking up, "is extremely achievable." Henry Beaumont came on Thursday. He always came on Thursday. He knew something was wrong before she said a word. She recognized that he could read her the way Mrs. Pettigrew could read a house by its sounds, its temperature, the particular quality of its attention. "Tell me," he said when they were seated with the tea. Neither of them was drinking. She told him. He listened the whole way through without interrupting, which was one of his qualities she had come to rely on without quite realizing when she had started relying on it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How are you?" he asked. "Not about the legal situation, not about the timeline, about her." "I don't know yet." She was honest because she had made a policy of honesty with him and did not intend to break it now. "I went through something like anger yesterday evening and something like grief this morning, and now I am mostly concerned about the logistics, which may be my way of not being concerned about the rest." "What is the rest?" She looked at her teacup. "The rest is that I spent an afternoon with Oliver last week and saw for the first time the man he could have been if he had paid attention a decade earlier. And I forgave him genuinely and sent him home with notes on the merchant contracts, and then before the week was out." She stopped. "I am not surprised. I want to be clear that I am not surprised. Oliver has always made decisions based on immediate consequence rather than long-term understanding. This is consistent." A pause. "But being unsurprised does not mean unaffected." Henry reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not a romantic gesture, not performing comfort, simply contact, the reassurance of another person present. She let it rest there. "You don't have to be unaffected," he said quietly. "You are allowed to be both unsurprised and hurt." "I'm not hurt." She thought about it. "I'm tired. There is a difference. Hurt implies expectation that was violated. I had no expectations left of Oliver. I'm tired of the weight of his decisions, continuing to require my attention when I have asked for nothing but to be left to build my own life." Henry's hand was still on hers. "Then let Crane handle it," he said. "That is what solicitors are for. You built something good last week in that conversation with Oliver. Whatever he does next does not undo what you built." She looked at him. "You are very calm about all of this," she said. "Most men in your position would be." What position am I in exactly? The question was gentle, but direct. The kind of question he had always asked, the one that required her to say the thing she was circling around rather than continue circling. A man who has expressed interest in a woman whose legal situation has just become significantly more complicated, she said precisely. Ah. He considered this. Yes, that is the position. He did not remove his hand. And I am calm about it because the complication is not of your making, and because I am 40 years old, and have lived long enough to know that the right things are rarely also the convenient things. He met her eyes. You are the right thing, Caroline. The convenient or inconvenient arrangement of the paperwork is a secondary matter. She had to look away for a moment. The east window. The garden. The corner where the bulbs had come up stronger than expected. You are making it very difficult, she said, to maintain appropriate emotional distance. Good, he said without apology. Oliver wrote to her directly 4 days later. The letter was short, shorter than any he had previously sent, which told her more about his state than the words themselves. Caroline. I expect you have heard. I do not know from where, it does not matter. I expect you have heard. I need to tell you that I do not know if it is true. I have no way to know. A solicitor is investigating. I am told the investigation will take some weeks. I am also aware that this affects your own legal situation, and I am sorry for that. Whatever else I have done, I did not intend. I would not deliberately. I am asking your solicitor to accelerate on my end. Whatever terms you need, whatever is fair. I will not contest. I owe you that much. I owe you considerably more. Oliver. She sat with the letter for a long time. Then she did something she had not done in months. She walked to the small framed mirror in the entrance hall and looked at herself directly, not checking her appearance. Looking at herself the way she sometimes needed to, the way a woman looks when she needs to take account of what is actually standing in front of her, rather than what she fears or hopes. She was 28 years old. She had run an estate larger than Harrowdale for 7 years without credit. She had left a marriage with nothing but her name and a property her mother had left her. She had rebuilt both in less than 6 months. She had planted bulbs in October that came up in April stronger than expected. She was 28 years old and she was not finished. Whatever happened with Miss Hartwell's claim, true or false, resolved quickly or drawn through months of legal argument, she was not going to allow it to determine the shape of her life. She had made that decision once in a reading room with an oil lamp and steady hands, and she was making it again now in front of a small mirror in an entrance hall that smelled faintly of her mother's rosewater. She went back to the writing desk. She wrote to Crane confirming Oliver's instructions to his solicitor and requesting the acceleration of all outstanding items. She wrote to Oliver 3 sentences she had received his letter. She accepted his terms. She wished him clarity on the question being investigated because certainty in either direction was better than indefinite suspense. Then she set both letters aside and turned to the account ledger. The east boundary fence needed materials ordered before the end of the month. The Porterhouse rental was ready to confirm. There was a question about the hay storage that Fenwick had flagged and that she wanted to resolve before the summer cut. She worked until noon. Eleanor Beaumont arrived unannounced that same afternoon, which was allowed. They had established over the preceding weeks the kind of friendship where announced and unannounced arrivals were both acceptable, which was the truest indication of genuine comfort. Eleanor came in, looked at Caroline's face, and sat down. Henry told me, she said. Not details, only that something had happened and you might want company, and he was not certain it was his place to be the company. Caroline looked at her. He sent you. He suggested. I decided. Eleanor settled herself with the ease of a woman who is very rarely uncertain of her welcome. There is a difference. Your family enjoys that distinction. We find it useful. Eleanor looked at her directly. Are you all right? I am. Caroline stopped. Started more honestly. I am managing, which is what I do. I am not certain managing and all right are always the same thing. They almost never are. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Can I tell you something that may be useful or may be impertinent, and I genuinely cannot predict which? Tell me. I was married at 22 to a good man who died at 30, Eleanor said. And in the years after I managed everything, my grief, my finances, my social position, the opinions of people who thought a widow of 26 should behave differently. I managed all of it so thoroughly that I forgot for about 3 years that there was a difference between managing your life and living it. The sitting room was very still. What changed? Caroline asked. I stopped being so impressive for a while, Eleanor said simply. I let things be difficult without solving them immediately. I let myself be in the middle of something without already planning my way out of it. She paused. You are extraordinarily capable, Caroline. Henry sees it. I see it. The whole of Harrowdale Valley sees it. And capability is a gift, genuinely. A pause. But you are also allowed to not know what comes next. You are allowed to be in the middle of this and not have the answer yet. Caroline felt something shift in her chest. The loosening of something she had not known was held tight. Again. The same loosening she had felt on the hill with Henry when he said she was exactly as capable as she was and called it enough. She was not accustomed to being seen clearly by people who did not then require something of her in return. I don't know what comes next, she admitted. With the legal matter. With any of it. Good, Eleanor said. That means you are paying attention. The investigation into Miss Hartwell's claim took 3 weeks. Caroline learned the outcome not from a letter, but from Crane in person, who traveled to Harrowdale on a Wednesday morning with the expression of a man carrying news that had multiple layers and intended to present them carefully. She brought him to the sitting room. Nan brought tea. Crane waited until Nan was gone. The investigation is complete, he said. Mr. Kingsley's solicitor and my own reached the same conclusion independently. Tell me. Miss Hartwell is indeed with child. That much is not in dispute. He paused. The child's father is not Oliver Kingsley. The room was very still. There is documentary evidence, Crane continued carefully. Correspondence primarily, between Miss Hartwell and a gentleman in London, a Mr. Prescott of the Prescott shipping family, that predates and overlaps with the period of her association with Kingsley. Mr. Prescott, when confronted with the evidence by Miss Hartwell's father, admitted his involvement. He looked at his notes, though Caroline suspected he did not need them. It appears Miss Hartwell's father was not aware of Mr. Prescott. He is not a wealthy man. Kingsley's estate, even in difficulty, represented a considerably more advantageous situation. Caroline absorbed this. She named Oliver, she said, because his name was more useful to her than the truth. That is the reasonable conclusion, yes. She sat with that for a moment. The calculated ruthlessness of it, the particular coldness of using a man's known vulnerability, his pride, his desire to be admired, his willingness to believe himself capable of inspiring passion in a 23-year-old woman as a financial instrument. And Oliver, who had destroyed 8 years of marriage for 3 months of being looked at that way, had nearly been destroyed again by the same mechanism. How is he? She asked. Crane looked at her with the expression of a man who had been a solicitor for 30 years and had seen a great many things and had learned to stop being surprised by human complexity, but occasionally still was. Shaken, he said. His solicitor says shaken. He is also apparently angry. Not at Miss Hartwell specifically. At himself. Crane paused. He asked me to tell you that he is sorry for the additional disruption. His exact words as relayed by his solicitor were, "Please tell Miss Wentworth that she is very nearly free of me, and I am trying to deserve that." Caroline looked at the east window. The garden was in full spring. Now the cleared corner blooming in earnest, and beyond the garden, the lane that Henry Beaumont had ridden up on 100 Thursdays. The broken gate that he opened with a lift and a push as naturally as breathing. She very nearly free of me. Oliver Kingsley, who had never quite had the language for generosity, trying to find it too late. Accelerate everything, she said. All of it. Whatever remains. I want it concluded within the month. I believe that is achievable, Crane said. Make it happen. She told Henry that evening. She had not planned to. He was not due until Thursday, and it was only Wednesday, and she had a strict internal policy about not manufacturing reasons to seek him out simply because she wanted to. But she had been sitting with the information for 3 hours, and she found that she wanted to tell him specifically, and that was its own kind of data point. She sent a note with Thomas. Henry arrived within the hour. She told him everything, standing in the sitting room, with neither of them seated, the afternoon going gold through the window. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. She used him, he said. Yes. And he, even after everything, part of him believed it. Part of him wanted to believe it, she said. That is different. He wanted to believe he had done the one thing that could not be undone because it would have simplified the guilt. She paused. If the child had been his, he would have had a clear obligation, and the guilt would have had a clear home. This way, the guilt is just guilt. There is no resolution for it. He must simply live with it. Henry looked at her. You understand him very well, he said. Even now. I spent 8 years learning to understand him. That knowledge does not evaporate because the marriage does. She met his eyes. Understanding someone is not the same as wanting them back. I know, he said quietly. I wasn't suggesting it was. I know you weren't. She paused. I was clarifying for myself as much as for you. He almost said something, stopped himself. What? She asked. I was going to say something about patience. He looked at her steadily. But you know that I have it. I don't need to keep saying so. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who organized his documents chronologically and absorbed information instead of waiting to speak, and opened broken gates with easy competence, and had spent 5 years behind a door that was closing now. 1 month, she said. Crane says 1 month for the legal matter to conclude. 1 month, he agreed. And then, she stopped. The then was large. The then contained more than she was ready to put into words, and she was a woman who prided herself on having words ready. And then Thursday, he said simply. She almost laughed. And then Thursday, she agreed. He left at dusk, and she stood at the window and watched him go, and the gate swung correctly behind him because Thomas had finally fixed the latch the previous week, and she was not sure exactly when she had started finding the correct swinging of that gate slightly disappointing. The legal documents were finalized on the 12th of May. Crane came with them in person because he had the old-fashioned view that significant documents deserved personal delivery, and Caroline signed everything at the sitting room table with the account ledger pushed to one side and Nan hovering in the doorway, pretending she had a reason to be there. When it was done, Crane gathered his papers and looked at her with the expression he had been carefully suppressing for 6 months. For what it is worth, he said, in 30 years of practice, I have not seen the matter handled with more dignity. Thank you, Mr. Crane. I mean it, Miss Wentworth. Genuinely. She walked him to the door. When his carriage was out of the lane, she stood in the entrance hall for a moment. The house breathed around her, the solid Georgian quiet of it, the smell of beeswax and the faint ghost of her mother's rose water that had never quite left. She was Caroline Wentworth. She had always been Caroline Wentworth. The 8 years of being Caroline Kingsley had been real. She did not disown them. They had made her as much as anything had, but she was not those years. She was not the woman in the portrait with the careful folded hands. She was the woman who had set the portrait face down on the table and walked out of the room without running. She was the woman who had planted bulbs in October and watched them come up. She went back to the sitting room. She picked up her pen. She wrote to Henry Beaumont. The letter was 3 sentences. The matter is concluded. I find I am no longer required to maintain appropriate emotional distance. If you have no other obligation on Thursday, I would like to walk the valley. She sent it before she considered revising it. The reply came back in 2 hours in Henry's unhurried hand. I have no other obligation on Thursday, or on any other day that you would find my presence useful. H. She put the letter in the desk drawer on top of the 2 letters from Oliver that she had decided after some thought to keep not as wounds, but as evidence of the distance she had traveled. The way you keep an old map of a place you no longer live in order to remember how far you've come. Then she opened the account ledger. The East Wing plasterwork was scheduled for completion next week. The porterhouse rental was generating its first income. The North Field had yielded its best spring numbers in a decade. She had a great deal of building still to do. And for the first time in a long time, for the first time perhaps in the whole of her adult life, she was not building alone. Thursday came in the particular way that Thursdays had come for months now, with the sound of a horse in the lane and the gate opening correctly, because the latch was fixed and had been fixed for weeks, and Caroline had stopped mourning the slight disappointment of that. She was ready when Henry arrived. Not waiting at the window, not arranged in the sitting room with tea already poured in the performance of casual welcome. She was in her coat standing in the entrance hall because she had said she wanted to walk the valley, and she had meant it. He looked at her when she opened the door, and something in his expression shifted, not surprise, but recognition. The look of a man seeing something he had been hoping to see, and finding it exactly as he had hoped. "You look different," he said. "The legal matter is concluded." "I know. That is not what I mean." She held his gaze for a moment. "Walk with me," she said. "I will explain on the way." They went out through the gate correctly smoothly, the hinge doing its job, and turned down the lane toward the valley. The May morning was full of light and birdsong, and the smell of the hawthorn coming into bloom along the hedgerows, and Caroline breathed it in, the way she had learned over these months to breathe things in fully, without reservation, without already planning what came next. "I have been thinking," she began, "about what it means to be finished." Henry walked beside her. He did not prompt her. He simply walked present and unhurried. "I told you in the autumn that I was not finished building what I was building, that I was not finished becoming who I was becoming." She watched the lane ahead. "I think I was right then. I also think I have been using that truth as a shield." Against what? Against the possibility of being wrong again. She said it plainly because she had made a policy of plainness with him, and the policy had served her well. "I was wrong about Oliver. Not entirely. I loved him genuinely. I gave him genuinely, and the choice to leave was correct. But I made the original choice to marry him based on what I hoped he would become, rather than what he was. And I spent 8 years adjusting myself to the distance between the hope and the reality." She paused. "That is an expensive way to learn a lesson. I did not want to repeat the tuition." Henry was quiet for a moment. "And now?" he asked. "Now I know what I see when I look at you," she said. "I am not looking at a hope. I am looking at evidence. 5 months of evidence presented every Thursday, and occasionally on days that are not Thursday, organized chronologically and argued without pretense." She glanced at him. "You are not a project I am undertaking. You are not a lesson I am still learning. You are the clearest thing in my life at the moment, and I have been treating that clarity as a reason for caution when it is actually the opposite." Henry stopped walking. She stopped too and turned to face him. He looked at her the way he looked at things that required his full attention, completely without deflection, with the particular quality of presence that she had recognized in their first real conversation and had been relying on without quite naming it ever since. "I am going to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer it honestly, not diplomatically." "When have I ever answered you diplomatically?" "Never. That is why I'm asking." He held her gaze. "Do you want this? Not are you ready? Not is the timing correct? Not is it prudent given the circumstances? Do you want this?" The question was very simple. The answer was simpler. Yes, she said. "I want this." The lane was very quiet. Henry reached out and took her hand. Not the formal handshake of business concluded. Not the reassuring contact of comfort offered across a table. He held her hand the way a man holds something he intends to keep. "Good," he said. They stood there for a moment in the May morning, with the hawthorn blooming, and the valley below them, and the whole of the spring stretching out ahead. And then they walked on, because there was ground to cover, and they were both people who covered ground.
Joel.
Eleanor Beaumont found out before anyone told her, which surprised no one who knew Eleanor. She appeared at Harrowdale on a Friday morning, a Friday deliberately, not a Thursday, giving them precisely 1 day of not being observed before the observing commenced, with the expression of a woman who had been right about something and was exercising considerable self-discipline about saying so. "I am not going to say I told you so," she announced, accepting tea from Nan with practiced ease. You just said the thing you were not going to say, Caroline pointed out. I said I was not going to say it. I didn't say I wasn't going to reference having not said it. There is a distinction. Eleanor settled herself with evident satisfaction. Henry came home yesterday in a mood I have not seen since before Margaret died. I recognized it immediately. He did not tell me anything, because he is constitutionally incapable of sharing personal information voluntarily, but he did not need to. Caroline looked at her across the tea table. Eleanor. Yes. Thank you. For coming to me in February. For saying what you said about managing versus living. Eleanor's expression softened genuinely without performance. Did it help? Considerably. I have been practicing not having the answer immediately. I find it is not comfortable exactly, but honest. It gets more comfortable, Eleanor said. Gradually. After a while you stop missing the certainty quite so much and start noticing what you find in the space where it used to be. What do you find? Different things, Eleanor said. Depending on the season. She sipped her tea. In your case, I suspect you will find Henry. He tends to occupy space that opens up. Caroline laughed, the real laugh, the one that arrived before she decided to permit it. Eleanor looked extremely pleased with herself. It was Margaret Alton who first said out loud what the village had evidently been thinking for several months. She said it in the dry goods shop in the direct and affectionate manner that 20 years of friendship permitted while measuring out the wool Caroline had come for. The whole valley knows he's courting you, Margaret said without preamble. The whole valley is efficient, Caroline replied. The whole valley has eyes. Margaret cut the wool with decisive scissors. He rode through the village last Tuesday, looking like a man who has made up his mind about something, and a man with that look on his face in the direction of Harrowdale Estate has a subject, and we all know what the subject is. Margaret, I am simply reporting facts. Margaret folded the wool with precise hands. The question the village is actually asking politely between themselves, because they respect you too much to ask directly, is whether you are going to let yourself have this. Caroline looked at her. Margaret looked back with the steady eyes of a woman who had known her since she was small and had watched her leave and come back and rebuild, and was not going to pretend any of this was simple. Let yourself, Margaret repeated quieter. Not whether you deserve it, not whether the timing is right, whether you are going to let yourself have something good after everything you have carried. The dry goods shop was warm and smelled of cloth and cedar, and Caroline stood in it and felt the question settle into her, like rain into dry ground. I am working on it, she said. Margaret nodded once the nod of a woman who finds this acceptable. Good, she said, and handed over the wool and refused payment again, and Caroline let her, because some things were best received without argument. The letter from Oliver arrived 3 weeks into May, and it was the last letter he would write to her. She knew it was the last before she opened it. Something in the weight of it, the particular care of the handwriting on the envelope, the sense of a man composing a final statement rather than a continuation of correspondence. She opened it on a Tuesday morning in the garden, sitting on the stone bench she had repaired in March, with the bulbs she had planted in full bloom around her. Caroline Crane tells me the matter is concluded on your end. Mine was concluded last week. You are free. I suppose I am also free, though that word sits differently on me than it likely does on you. I have been trying to write this letter for a month. Every draft was either too much or too little. I have decided to simply say what is true and leave the eloquence to people better suited to it. You were the best thing in my life. I did not know that while you were in it, which is the precise nature of my failure, and not a failure of small consequence. You saved my estate, my name, and I believe, though I did not deserve it, something of my character, because watching you leave with your dignity intact, while I had none, left me nothing to hide behind. A man with nowhere to hide must eventually look at himself clearly. I do not know what I see entirely, but I am looking. I hear through the sort of channels that carry this kind of information that Henry Beaumont has been a frequent presence in Harrowdale this spring. I do not know the shape of that. I do not need to. I only want to say he is a good man. Better than me, I think, in the ways that matter most. If you allow it to become something, you will be in good hands. You deserved good hands from the beginning. I am sorry it took me so long to understand that. I am sorry it was not me. With whatever love I have learned to give honestly." Oliver Caroline sat with the letter for a long time. The garden was warm around her, and the birds were extremely opinionated in the hedgerows, and somewhere in the lane she could hear Thomas talking to the horse in the comfortable, repetitive way he had talked to horses for 40 years. She cried. Not the 20-minute grief she had permitted herself in the reading room last autumn. Something quieter and longer than that, the kind of crying that is not grief exactly, but the emotional accounting for a very long period of something genuinely difficult. 8 years of a marriage that had contained real love poorly expressed on both sides in different ways. The specific loneliness of being invisible to someone who was supposed to see you. The cost of leaving. The cost of staying would have been higher. She cried, and then she stopped, and she sat in the garden with the letter in her hands and felt finished. Not empty. Finished the way a piece of work is finished when you have done everything you could with it and it is time to put it down. She wrote back that afternoon. "Oliver, thank you for this letter. It is the best thing you have ever written me, and I do not say that to wound you. I say it because honesty is what we both needed 20 years earlier, and it is better late than not at all. Take care of yourself. Take care of the estate. Give Amos Greer's drainage the attention it deserves. I know you know which fence dispute I mean. Do not waste the clarity you have found. That is the only thing I ask of you. I wish you well. Genuinely. Caroline." She sealed it, set it with the post, and did not look back. Henry proposed on a Saturday in June. Not on a Thursday, which Caroline would later think was the most Henry Beaumont thing possible to do. The significant thing on an unexpected day, without the scaffolding of established habit, because it was the right moment, and the right moment did not wait for Thursdays. They had been at Beaumont Hall for the afternoon. Eleanor's idea, a small supper that had expanded in the easy way, that evenings expand when no one is keeping track of time. And afterward, Henry had walked her home, which had become a natural conclusion to evenings that ended at Beaumont Hall, the two of them walking the lane between properties in the long summer dusk. They were at the Harrowdale gate when he stopped. She turned. How was not performative about it. He did not construct elaborate ceremony. He was Henry Beaumont, who organized documents chronologically, and stated what was obvious, and did things because they were the right things to do, and he proposed the way he did most things directly, completely, with nothing wasted. "I want to marry you," he said. Not because the timing is convenient, and not because it is the expected conclusion of the past 6 months, and not because it resolves any particular situation. "I want to marry you because you are the person I want to be standing beside while we are both building something." A pause. "I said once that I would like you beside me while we build a life. I meant it. I still mean it." Caroline looked at him. Her heart was doing something entirely undignified, and she was a woman who had made a point of dignity, and she found she did not remotely care. "That is the most practical marriage proposal I have ever heard," she said. "It's the most honest one I could make. It is also," she said, "exactly the right one." He waited. She had made him wait 6 months. She did not make him wait another moment. "Yes," she said. "Henry, yes." He stepped forward and took her face in his hands. Careful, deliberate, nothing wasted, and kissed her in the June dusk at the gate of Harrowdale House, and the gate stood correctly on its fixed hinge behind her, and the valley was gold below them, and she was 28 years old, and had never in her life felt so precisely completely herself. Eleanor cried at the wedding in September. She cried with the unashamed efficiency of a woman who had decided to feel things fully and saw no reason to apologize for the fact. And she pressed a handkerchief to her eyes during the ceremony, and then composed herself completely by the time it was over, and spent the reception being magnificently social and entirely collected. And Caroline loved her enormously for both. Margaret Alton came with her husband and 3 daughters, and cried more openly than Eleanor, which was somehow exactly right. Robert Fenwick stood in the back of the chapel with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who was glad to be there and would never say so in words, but whose presence said everything necessary. Old Dr. Marsh, who had delivered Caroline into the world and watched her grow and told her the village was glad she was back, sat in the front pew and held her hand briefly before the ceremony and said nothing at all, because some things did not require words from a man who had known you long enough. Henry stood at the front of the chapel and watched her walk toward him with the full, steady attention he had given everything from the beginning. The survey documents, the tenant questions, the drainage problem, the broken gate, the letters to magistrates, the Thursdays and the non-Thursdays, all of it. And when she reached him, his expression was not the expression of a man receiving something he had won. It was the expression of a man who understood precisely and completely what he was being given and intended to be worthy of it. That was everything. 2 years later, Harrowdale Estate was the most efficiently run property in the north of Yorkshire. The Beaumont land and the Wentworth land were jointly managed with a clarity of organization that Crane the solicitor referred to in a letter to a colleague as the most remarkable example of cooperative land stewardship I have encountered in 30 years of practice. The Northfield drainage had become something of a local model. 3 other estates in the valley had sent representatives to ask about the methodology. Caroline managed the accounts. She made decisions. She wrote letters to magistrates with precisely calibrated deference to their vanity, and got roads fixed and disputes resolved and arrangements made. She negotiated with merchants and read surveys, and rode out in November rain to speak with tenant farmers who were ready to leave, and she listened. Actually listened and found solutions, and the farmers stayed. Henry managed beside her. He brought his own competence and his organized documents and his honest questions, and the steady patience of a man who had learned not to confuse a woman's capability with a threat to his own. He asked her opinion. He waited for the answers. He disagreed with her sometimes directly without performance, and she disagreed back, and they reached conclusions that were better than either of them had arrived at alone. On a Tuesday morning in October, Caroline stood at the east window of the house that had always been hers, watching Henry ride out to the far boundary with Fenwick beside him. And she understood something she had been understanding gradually for 2 years, in the way that the deepest truths tend to arrive not all at once, but in small accumulations, the way ground absorbs rain. She had not been rescued. She had not been restored to what she was before. She had not been given something she lacked. She had built something. She had built herself piece by piece in the 6 months before Henry's proposal from the foundations her mother had left, and the discipline she had always carried, and the clarity that came from finally setting down a weight she had carried too long. She had planted bulbs in October and watched them come up in April. She had written letters that got roads repaired. She had sorted 11-year legal questions in 2 conversations. She had forgiven Oliver Kingsley and meant it and moved on and not looked back. And then she had chosen clearly, with full knowledge, with eyes open and hands steady, to let someone stand beside all of that and be glad of it. Not to complete her, not to rescue her, to stand beside her while they built something together, something that neither of them could have built alone, something that was already stronger and more surprising than either of them had planned. She turned from the window. The account ledger was open on the desk. There were 3 letters to answer, and a meeting with Fenwick at noon, and a question about the eastern boundary that needed resolving before the first frost. She sat down. She picked up her pen. She had a great deal of building still to do, and the life she was building it in was entirely, completely, irreversibly her own. That was how Caroline Wentworth, who had once spent 8 years waiting to be seen, who had set down a portrait and walked out of a room without running, who had planted things in frozen ground and trusted them to grow, became the woman she had always been capable of being. Not because someone finally chose her, because she chose herself first, and everything worthwhile came after that.